Hello, welcome to the Busy Moms Book Club. You could be watching this on a YouTube replay, or you could be listening to this on the Mom on Purpose podcast. Either way, I hope you're going to enjoy the book that we're doing today. So just really quick, my name is Laura Johnson. I'm a certified life coach for moms, and I love this book club because you don't have to read the book to join. You can come and you can listen and learn about the book and how to apply the book. And part of my critical mission, I feel like my part of my purpose here on this earth is to make sure that we're all learning about who we are and what our purpose is. And I find that the more we discover more about who we are and who we are by divine design, like I truly do believe we all came with a unique set of skills and different aspects of our lives, the more we embrace that, the easier it is to fulfill whatever purpose that we have. And so that's why I loved this book so much, because I will show you, it is called Quiet, The Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking, by Susan Cain. And I was talking to Ansi, who's on right now live, and what I have found with this book is that I have felt very seen and very heard on a very deep level as I was reading this book. So whether you identify as an introvert, or you know someone that does, or you suspect that they have introverted qualities about them, that this book club is for you. Okay, this book is for you. So we're going to start with a little bit of a game before I dive into some of my thoughts about the book, and then we'll go into the actual book itself and learn more about it. So this book club is for you, is if you dislike small talk and you'd rather go to deep conversations. I have found that this is me, that on many levels, I will ask very personal questions to people I really don't know very well and can create very awkward scenarios for myself and for others. But that's just who I am. I really prefer going deep very quickly. Another aspect, you'll know this book club is for you, is if you find that you need a lot of downtime after spending time with other people, even if you love spending time with other people. I've noticed this a lot with church. So as part of my church community, I am in charge of singing time for all of the kids and teaching them songs about Jesus. And there's probably we're probably 75 kids. And even though I love it, I'm not musical, let's be clear on that, but I love being with the kids. I love being able to sing songs with them and play games with them. I find that afterwards, I'm flat on my back, totally exhausted. I need a lot of downtime after I go to church. So if that's something that resonates with you, if you go out to a networking event, if you go out to a church group, volunteering, even if you're out with your girlfriends and you absolutely love it, but you come home exhausted, this book club is for you. You'll also know that this book club is for you is if you find that the noise of motherhood and life is a lot for your body and for your nervous system, to the point where you feel like you get really agitated and overstimulated, and you'll start snapping at people around you. Even though you love them, you'll just find that your body is almost on high alert. The next one is if you find that you avoid conflict, that you are very sensitive to other people's feelings getting hurt. And it's painful to your soul anytime that you engage in this conflict. Maybe somebody is more explosive and you retreat back very quickly. And then the last one you'll know this book club is for you is if you know someone that fits into any of the four prior things. Because, and we'll talk about this in the book, but she talks about how there is a high number of introverts that live among us, and that most of them are masking as extroverts because that is the ideal of the nation that we live in. And because of that, and because they're rewarded for extroverted type aspects of personality, many are masking to fit this, extroverted ideal. And so it's really hard to get clear on who is an actual introvert. And this will give you a lot of insight into yourself or maybe loved ones, where there's maybe behavior that you don't quite understand. And you'll get a little more clear as we go through this book. So as she, and I'll tell you a little bit about what I thought, what I was surprised about was, one, how big it was. Like, I kind of thought that, extroverted, introverted, I've never really studied a lot of research about it. This is a very heavily researched book, which I really enjoy. I really like reading stories and a lot of research about how they have come to the conclusions on introvert versus extrovert. Also, with that, I felt like it was very meaty. So I felt like I couldn't sit and read a lot of it at the same time. Whereas, some of our past books, they're a little lighter and I feel like you can kind of binge read it pretty quickly. This was one I felt like I needed to take my time and really digest a lot of it. So when she's presenting a story, it's not just like one story per chapter, there's a different story for each paragraph. And so there was a lot of stories. So I'm not gonna cover most of the stories and a lot of the research she shares, just because there was so much of it in the book. But as you read it for yourself, if you choose to do that, just know and plan and prepare for that. And it is fantastic. For me personally, I felt like I had to digest it in little bits. So she breaks the book down into, like, first is the introduction, and then she breaks it down into 4 different sections. And we're going to go through each of those sections. That's kind of how we're going to format this book club. But just to start, I'm going to talk about what she mentions in the introduction. And so in the introduction, she says that, let me see if I can find it actually really quick. She talks about some of what our society values here in the United States. She says, we're told that to be great is to be bold, to be happy is to be sociable. We see ourselves as a nation of extroverts, which means that we've lost sight of who we really are. And so I like that she really mentions that straight from the beginning, is that to be great, here, let me erase this. To be great is to be bold. And then she said, no, I lost it. To be happy. To be happy is to be sociable. And this is like the extroverted ideal. And as part of this, she said, we as a nation put a lot of value on individuality, but that value of individuality comes from a very specific type of individual, and that's somebody that puts themselves out there. Now, the more you put yourself out there, the more value our nation puts on that individual. And this was really like hard to swallow, but it made a lot of sense to me. Because what I have found in my past is that when it was hard for me to do these things, I thought I was fundamentally flawed and therefore not as good as someone else that could do these things, instead of really honoring that that's just not who I am. And I was able to see that, and we'll talk about this in just a second, that there was this extroverted ideal that existed in the world that we put a lot of value and pressure to perform in that way, because therefore you could be happier, you could be more valuable to whatever, your work, your community, whatever that might be. But what I really love is that in this book, she talks a lot about, our quiet power, our quiet strength. And she lists some really amazing examples about people that were really great. Warren Buffett, Gandhi, Rosa Parks, Eleanor Roosevelt, just to name a few that she uses as examples that they became great because of their introversion, not in spite of it. And I really appreciated that she said that, because for every single one of us that does identify as an introvert, that's exactly what it is. We can succeed and be happy because of our introversion, not in spite of it. So she goes on to share in the very beginning, and I'm just going to briefly read these just because I think it's so beneficial for each of us. This is she talks about how there's like a spectrum, that we fall on. And that this is a very informal quiz that she gives us in the book. But of course, I love quizzes. I will always take a quiz if it's given to me. So just kind of think about this for yourself. The more truths that you have, the more likely you are introverted, or the more introverted you are. Okay. So just the first one, I prefer one-on-one conversations to group activities. Second, I often prefer to express myself in writing. Third, I enjoy solitude. Fourth, I seem to care less than my peers about wealth, fame, and status. Fifth, I dislike small talk, but I enjoy talking in depth about topics that matter to me. 6, people tell me I'm a good listener. 7, I'm not a big risk taker. 8, I enjoy work that allows me to dive in with few interruptions. 9, I like to celebrate birthdays on a small scale with only 1 or 2 close friends and family. 10, people describe me as soft-spoken or mellow. 11, I prefer not to show or discuss my work with others until it's finished. 12, I dislike conflict. 13, I do my best work on my own. 14, I tend to think before I speak. 15, I feel drained after being out and about, even if I enjoyed myself. 16, I often let calls go to voicemail. That one made me laugh. I do that every time. You can ask my mom, she'll tell you. And it's my mom. Like, I should be able to answer the phone to my mom. 17, if I had to choose, I prefer a weekend with absolutely nothing to do. Nothing to do to one. I prefer nothing to do instead of too many things scheduled. There we go. Number 18, I don't enjoy multitasking. Number 19, I can concentrate easily. Number 20, in classroom situations, I prefer lectures to seminars. And so yeah. So Ansi is sharing over in the chat. She said, yes, I remember taking the quiz, only 5 falses. Yes, I only had 4 falses. And so even on that, I was like, oh, some of these I could probably see. So it made me laugh as I took that quiz. And as I went through those, it was like, oh, my whole life is making much more sense. And it was this just big aha moment that I had on some of like my awkwardness that I've always felt like I had wasn't actually awkwardness, it was just introversion. And so what I really like is that in this first section, she starts talking about the extroverted ideal. And she provides extrovert ideal. She provides a really interesting timeline for us where she says, starting back, as we are looking through history, prior to about the 1920s, so I'm going to say prior to 1920, there was a culture of character. Now, this culture of character, she explains it, was more focused on how people behaved in private. But starting in about 1920, there came a culture of what she calls personality. Now, this introduction of personality, this culture of personality, started to focus on how other people perceived that individual. She said, suddenly it went from inner virtue, which is the culture of character, to outer charm. And when we look at it that way, like we all think, okay, we don't really need to care what other people think. But when you really see it in this way, and I'm going to continue to describe it, the extrovert ideal, we do put a lot of pressure and a lot of value on how other people perceive us, how extroverted, how open, how charismatic we are, how magnetic that we are. And this is the culture of personality. And so she shares the example of Dale Carnegie, where he's very famous author. He has a lot of business courses, the Carnegie, I can't remember the name of like his business school that he created, that still continues on. And it really was this shift from like going to a farm boy to being one of the top salespeople, and then training and creating business courses based on this culture of personality, which started about 1920. And so it was interesting because then she goes on to say, in about 1940, this continued to shift to where universities started to put a lot of value on all of the extracurricular activities. Extroverts are very good on teams and being involved with everything and juggling a lot of stuff. And so then at this point in 1940, universities started to also weigh in on how extroverted somebody was and how charismatic and magnetic they all were. Those were the people they wanted in their university. They weren't giving a lot of space for the brilliant introverted minds. Okay, so then it doesn't stop there. He says she says by about 1960, 1/3 of the prescriptions that were being given by doctors were for anxiety, for quote unquote not fitting in. Isn't that fascinating? 1/3 of the prescriptions were for anxiety, for people for not being able to fit in. That was like how they advertised it. Now, and then by 1990, okay, and this is just, continuing to snowball. She said by 1990, the DSM-IV or 1V, I'm not sure how it's the psychiatric Bible of mental disorders. Like every disorder that we have classified out there is within this book. Okay, the DSM something. She said that by 1990, they actually listed the fear of public speaking as a disease, not just something that's like scary for people, but an actual disease was listed in there. And so what was fascinating about this was just to see that this history, right here, public speaking disease. And so it was just fascinating to me to see the history and how this has evolved over time, and to give ourselves some permission that we're living in a really hard world as introverts. And this is very deeply ingrained into our society. So then she goes on to say, after 1990 and continuing on to where we're living right now, she calls it the rise of the charismatic leaders. And you'll see this in a lot of the self-help industries. And she uses the example that, as the rise of self-help came about, it was what they were teaching and what they were preaching was to become more extroverted. Because that's where you are happier and that's where you're more successful. And so she shares an example about Tony Robbins, where the whole experience that he has, the way that he teaches, is very charismatic, it's very extroverted. And the things he's teaching are to help you harness your power to be able to be a better salesperson, to be able to be more to be more successful, to be able to put yourself out there in this way. And that's when your life will be better. That's when your life will improve. And so I love that example, especially because I'm very deeply ingrained in the self-help industry. And I've seen that for myself, is how, especially when I launched my business, I really felt like that's what I had to do. And I floundered for a long time because it felt so unnatural for me. Now I've learned to harness a lot of my introversion. I've learned to know when to be extroverted, and we'll talk more about that on really being able to, develop some of those extroverted skills. Like I've always kind of laughed even before reading this book that I'm an introvert trained as an extrovert because there are times where I do need to have some of those skills. But for me, it was really beneficial to see that this is very deeply ingrained into our society. And that's why for the longest time, I was feeling very flawed for who I fundamentally am. She goes on to share an example about Harvard Business School, where the extrovert ideal is very deeply ingrained. Those are the people that they are recruiting and actively fostering those skills. So she shared a couple different examples about how the people that are most vocal within Harvard Business School are the ones who get their ideas accepted. And this will come into play in just a little bit. And she said that as they are fostering this, what they're really looking for are the people that are slow talkers, that are more introverted. They are not the ones that are really thriving and being successful. And they are not the ones that are really getting the support of their classmates and all of that. Because in order to really succeed there, you have to be more vocal. You have to be the loudest person in the room. And that can be really challenging for a lot of the students that are introverted there. And she interviews and talks about, a lot of people there. So wanted to share, just briefly where this extroverted ideal has come into play for me and has been very difficult within business. And I've had to learn how to harness my own power. And so it was probably for like a year and a half, 2 years, I sold corporate workshops. And corporate workshops are very fun. I always thought that that's what I would be doing. I would really enjoy being in the corporate space. But in the very beginning, one of the very first workshops that I did, I was presenting to a bunch of PhDs about working from home. This was back during COVID, and working from home with their children. And it was a really good workshop. I'm not going to lie. Like, I know my information really well, but I am not the fastest talker in the room. Like, when I get excited, I might talk a little faster, but for the most part, I'm very intentional. And she talks about that in the book. Like, I think before I speak. I'm very specific about the words that I say. And that's just part of who I am. And the feedback that I got, from the workshops that I did for these PhDs is that they didn't value what I said because I wasn't smart. Now, what's interesting is I did the exact same workshop for a more, it was like a construction company. They built furniture and they very much valued it. The only difference was the extrovert ideal. Like the PhDs, because I was speaking slower, they took that as I was not as smart, because this is such a deeply ingrained thing within our society. Whereas when I was among like construction workers, where that extroverted ideal may not, they're all working on their own, building this furniture, it was a very different experience. And so that's just one of the examples I wanted to share, where it's okay if you've come across this extrovert ideal and you have gotten negative feedback because you didn't live up to that ideal in some way. That doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. Okay. Just to be very clear, all introverts have had that feedback at some point. That's okay. It's okay to release that, to forgive the people, and to really own like who you are at this point, and to still believe in yourself and the natural abilities and talents that you have. They just might look different than somebody who is extroverted. Okay. It doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you. So then she goes on to share, that's kind of the history. That's kind of like the charismatic myths that you have to be a Tony Robbins or a Harvard Business School, like outgoing vocal student there. What she goes on to share is that introverts actually change the world. And I love the examples that she uses, because what she talks about is that introverts are the ones that see and hear the world. Okay, they're the ones that are hearing the suggestions. They're the ones that are observing the world around them, and they're implementing those things. Because of that, they're the ones that are out there changing the world on a much different scale. And we'll talk about how in a minute, the difference between how the extroverted person can change the world, and sometimes they can sabotage the world, whereas, the introverts can also change the world and sabotage it as well if they're not harnessing their own innate abilities. So the example that she uses, let's first stay here, where the introverts, where they see and hear the world. The first example she uses she talks about Rosa Parks. And now she shares the example, like Rosa Parks was a very quiet, she was a woman of strong Christian faith, very integratable. And when she chose not to give up her seat, it created such a movement, not because she was loud, not because she was a giant. She was also very small in stature, but because her quiet strength was so integratable that people couldn't help but rally behind her. Like the character that she had was so intense and so strong that it created over a year long boycott of the Montgomery, Alabama, the buses. And I really appreciated that they used that example. One, because Rosa Parks is a hero of mine. It's one we talk with our kids. We've got books on Rosa Parks. We talk about her a lot. But also because it really showed me that our quiet strength, our quiet power can create movements. And those movements, she was not the charismatic Martin Luther King Jr. She was one that was, behind the scenes. But because of the character she had, it like people couldn't help but rally behind her. And that's what happens when you find your quiet strength and you find your purpose and you start moving forward in that. People can't help but rally to the movement that you feel, and they will want to join the ranks with you. So she also goes on to talk about, with introverts, is that with the rise of social media, we have the ability to create movement in a new way that may not have been possible for us before. And I'll tell you why I'm laughing in just a second, but she talks about how sometimes with social media or with screens, it provides that barrier for us that we need in order for us to feel secure. And I've found that in my own business is that it is sometimes easier for me to post and to interact with people online than it is for me to go to a networking event and sit down and talk with a bunch of people. And so I've always laughed with my coaching friends that I feel like, because I've gotten to know so many people through social media all around the world, which is such a huge blessing. But I feel like when I actually meet them in person at an event, I need a t-shirt that says I'm more awkward in person, #introvert, because that's me. I think people, in these settings, I'm very talkative and I'm talking about things I'm passionate about. But then if you put me in a social situation where I'll probably meet you in person, I will be very awkward. and I think sometimes it takes people, by surprise a little bit, because I am very different when you're hearing me in this kind of situation. Ansi says 100%. Yeah, it's just one of those things that it just kind of makes me laugh about myself. And so what I really appreciate and what I've come to love and really be able to harness my ability on is that social media does provide that medium for me that maybe I probably wouldn't have had if I were only doing in-person events. So the other thing that she talks about, which I thought was very fascinating when we're talking about this extroverted ideal, she talks about the evangelical culture. And I love one of the things that she said is she says, there's kind of this extroverted ideal that has seeped into the evangelical, the Christian culture, or that if you don't love Jesus out loud, then it must not be real love. So she talks about really being able, as an introvert, being able to share your beliefs on Jesus Christ or to keep them very private, because introverts like to, talk about things on a very different level than, standing on a soapbox and telling everybody within their church community. And so I just wanted to share a really brief story on that is, so many years ago, I served a mission for my church where I got to go and teach people in Canada about Jesus Christ. And it was so painful. You can go back and ask some of the other missionaries that were with me, where we would be walking and people would just walk by, and I would just stand there like a statue, completely frozen, I couldn't talk to them. And I remember feeling so guilty that if I really loved Jesus, then this wouldn't be hard. And it was this constant battle that I hit up against. And so when she shared this experience, or when she shared this, evangelical culture and this extroverted ideal within the terms of church service, it was oh my gosh, this makes so much sense on why I honestly couldn't say the words to a stranger, even though I really love Jesus. So I appreciated that she brought that in there. And so when she's talking about it, again, she's bringing us back to what are our strengths as introverts. And so then she talks about, really getting clear on who we are as introverts and really recognizing what our strengths are, and that we don't have to meet this extroverted ideal in order for us to be really strong, passionate leaders. One of the things that she also mentioned before we go on to the next, section, and she talks about how introverts, they like to work independently, and oftentimes that working independently is the catalyst for innovation. So she said, as part of this extroverted ideal, is that there is a term called groupthink. And if you've ever studied communications, groupthink is like when a whole group together, like somebody introduces an idea and people follow along with the idea without actually questioning it. So groupthink oftentimes where somebody will introduce an idea that's not actually a good idea, but because nobody questions it, everybody kind of gets on board with this idea. It actually gets you an unwanted result. And so the thing that she talks about here is that the new groupthink is that we should elevate teamwork. Now, this has seeped into workplaces, this has seeped into our schools, this has seeped into, excuse me, this has seeped into so many different aspects of our lives, like pushing our kids to sports or, whatever, because we think that teamwork is the most essential thing for us to learn. She said, well, and I'll also add in here that as I was reading this, it was funny to my mind that I was thinking, when our kids are young, we all want them to play independently, but yet we hold them to this ideal that we all have to learn how to work in a team. But then when we're at home, we're like, but no, like, leave me alone. So they're getting kind of like these mixed messages as children on like, do you want us to play independently? Do you want us to learn this teamwork? Plus, like, whatever they're naturally drawn to. And so what I really appreciate is how much she dove into like really understanding this. So she says on page 84, she talks about some of the studies they've done, like with programmers, for example. And programmers are typically more introverted because they're able to work on their own. But what she noticed was that there was one company that had a lot of top performers. She said the top performers overwhelmingly worked for companies that gave their workers the most privacy, personal space, control over their physical environments, and freedom from interruption. She said, which I really thought that was so fascinating. And then she goes into the open space concept that a lot of businesses have introduced because we have elevated this teamwork, meaning there aren't offices, there aren't cubicles, everything is out in the open. And I remember my husband works for a tech company. Well, he works for a different tech company, but the one before, and they had this open space concept. And I remember walking in, it like took my breath away. It's like, how does anybody work like this? Like, it was so uncomfortable for me just to see it, because I need to like hover down and work independently. And I do really well in that scenario. Same thing back when, I was working in an office. This was back, before I had kids, when I actually like went into an office, and I was put in a room with there was 3 of us total. And I just remember feeling so uncomfortable. It wasn't that I cared that they saw what was on my screen. It was like I needed to mentally barricade myself from like all the stimulation, and I needed to just be in my own world. And so I had to like mentally create that space for me. Not that I didn't love my coworkers. I had fantastic coworkers, but it was very overwhelming to like my nervous system. Okay, so, and that's where she like really talks about is that we have to intentionally start creating these spaces where we can work independently and with privacy and be in control of our environment. Okay, so I really wanted to spend a lot of time on that because it's going to make everything else easier as you start exploring the rest of the book to again realize there is nothing fundamentally wrong with you if you don't fit into this extroverted ideal. So she goes on to say, is it your biology or is it yourself? meaning, is it nature? Are you born with it? Or is it nurture? Meaning there is the environment that you've been raised in to create different aspects of it. And so she said back in 1989, trying to figure out how much control we have over this extroverted introvert. And she said back in 1989, somebody by the name of Jerome Kagan, I think is how you say his name, took 500 4-month-olds and showed them different sensory things, like new things, like a cotton swab, or, a picture of something or a sound, and just to see how they reacted. He said of those, there were 20% were highly reactive, meaning their arms started moving a lot. 40%, which were very low reactive, meaning that they didn't respond to these different things. And then another 40% that were kind of in between. So what they suspected was the ones that were highly interactive or highly reactive would be extrovert. But it was actually opposite. So those babies that were highly reactive went on and they continued to study them, I think all the way up until adulthood. That 20% that were highly reactive to the different stimuli were the ones that were introverted. Now, this whole section had a lot of really great science about the brain and all of that. So I'm going to briefly talk about that. But if you want to dive deep into it, you will have to get the book. But what he talked about is when they looked at a part of the brain called the amygdala. Hopefully I said that right, amygdala. This is what they call the emotional brain. This is where your basic instincts of flight or fight or freeze come from. And he said, the more active the amygdala was, the more your heart rate increased and the more stress hormone of cortisol was released in your body. It caused your body to be overstimulated, which means that you are more introverted. You're more, you want to stop and observe the world because your body responds at a higher level to it. You become much more, your nervous system is much more sensitive to the environment. As a result, you are someone that observes and thinks and feels on a much deeper level. And what was interesting about this is he said that highly reactive children that then turn into highly reactive adults, which are introverts, he said they're kind of like orchids, meaning that they can wilt very easily when they are overstimulated, but in the right atmosphere, they can really blossom and flourish and become very strong. He said it also depends, that's where the nature comes from. Some people's amygdalas just react higher. Okay, that's the nature part. We're just born with that. So, but on the flip side, given the environment that it's placed in, a highly reactive child can either become a hero, learn to harness those strengths, or a bully, they're so reactive to what's happening that they start acting out. And so really the way in which we nurture what our nature is going to determine whether or not we really succeed or fail. So he then goes on to talk about, I keep saying he, I'm talking about Kagan in this situation, which was Jerome Kagan who did this experiment. Okay. But she, meaning Susan Cain, she goes on to talk about free will. And now free will, meaning what we do with our nature. She goes on to say that our brains are very elastic, meaning that we can learn and adjust as we go, and we can shape our brain. She said at some point, our brain has the capacity to take our fears and learn how to self-soothe them. So the amygdala, part of the nature, is very highly reactive, meaning we get overstimulated, but all of those fears that are overstimulating, we have the ability as part of our free will to learn how to soothe those fears. And as we start soothing them, our amygdala will still fire rapid fire, but we start learning the coping skills in order to handle that. So it never goes away. It's still part of us, but it's not overcoming us. And I've seen how much that's true for me. Like there are certain things that I will still do where it's like, gosh, am I not over this yet? Like, why am I still so stressed out about this? And I'm always amazed that like, even though I've like gone through it so many times, I'm learning how to self-soothe at a much quicker at a quicker pace. She goes on to say that as part of this, we have to make sure that we are learning our sweet spots. And I like the word that she used there, like our sweet spots for this self-soothing. Now, within these sweet spots, we are learning what is our stimulation, like what really makes us like overstimulated. And at this point, this is where we learn how to create an environment. We're learning how to work with our body, all of these things in order for us to start calming our amygdala, calming our emotional brain, as she calls it. Now, this is part of our survival strategy. This is why we've been so successful, is because we have learned to become very adaptable and to adjust and find those sweet spots where we can succeed. And so this is where we really start to harness our power. Now, she goes on to say that as we're looking at the introverted, extroverted, now it's important to recognize that not only is our amygdala or our emotional brain different, we also process a hormone called dopamine. Now, dopamine is what gives us like that high, that natural buzz. Now, the extrovert, okay, we'll put extrovert. The extrovert, we all have the way we react to what she calls a reward sensitivity. The extrovert will get a higher buzz from different rewards. The introvert gets a lower buzz. Now, for the extrovert, she kind of mentions this, like a really good example she uses in the book is like gambling. When they win and they get that dopamine hit, extroverts, they get a much higher buzz. It's more fun for them. And she said, that's kind of sad for the introverts. But here's the interesting thing is that, sorry, I've got my phone call. So with the extrovert, the buzz, it also causes them, this buzz causes them not to see warning signs because they're too high on their buzz. She said, now the opposite is that the introverts can see warning signs. And because of this, they can't see those warning signs. And so I loved the example that she shared. I actually was sitting in bed and I sat up in bed and I was like, I told my husband, I'm like, you've got to hear this because, he's introverted as well. And I'm like, this makes so much sense to me. Where, we as introverts we don't have as high of reward sensitivity. We don't get as high of a dopamine hit, but we can also see things that other people can't. So it's like the secret superpower that we have. And so the example she talks about in the book is with the 2008 housing crash. And she has very specific examples of where there were introverts that knew it was coming, but because of their introversion and because they hadn't learned how to harness their power, they were not heard over the extroverted ideal leaders that were happening. And so even though people could see that it was coming, they couldn't get their voices heard to the level of really being able to motivate change. And so she said, it's not just enough to be an introvert and to be okay being an introvert. It's learning how to use your gifts to your benefit so you can be heard. So when these warning signs do come up, whether at work or, in family, in a relationship with your children, whatever that might be, you know how to harness those abilities to get your voice heard. So she then goes on to talk about, how to harness strengths. Let me find it really quick. She talks about for us as introverts, it's important for us to find our flow using our gifts. She says that the biggest challenge may be to fully harness your strengths. She said, you may be busy trying to appear like a zestful, reward sensitive extrovert, that you undervalue your own talents and feel underestimated by those around you. But when you're focused on a project that you care about, you probably find that your energy is boundless, which I have seen this time and time again. She says, don't let others make you feel as if you have to race. She says, if you enjoy depth, don't force yourself to speed up. If you prefer single tasking to multitasking, stick to your guns. Being relatively unmoved by rewards gives you an incalculable power to go your own way. She goes on to say that introverts also need to learn how to trust their gut and share their ideas as powerfully as they can. That doesn't mean trying to be an extrovert. She says ideas can be shared quietly. They can be communicated in writing. They can be packaged in highly produced lectures. They can be advanced by allies. Which I love the example, again, going back to Rosa Parks, like Martin Luther King really helped, like he was her ally in helping her advance the cause. She said the trick for introverts is to honor their own styles instead of allowing themselves to get swept up in the prevailing norms. And I really appreciated that she talked about that because it's so important for us as introverts to get super clear on what our strengths are. And the more that we get so clear on that, the more we move towards it, the more courage we have to act in our own way. That's when amazing things happen. And it's interesting because I've seen how much that's played out in my parenting. As I've really looked at my own children, they don't fit the extroverted ideal. They are neurodivergent. I've got one that's autistic. I've got another that I suspected maybe. She's definitely introverted, and we've tried to push them through sports, all those things that we did in the beginning. And I was able to step back and realize that's not where their strengths are. And me being able to measure them to some other kid that was extroverted did more damage to our relationship than anything else. And I had to let go of what that extrovert ideal was and to be able to really understand what their power was as more of an introvert. So then she goes on, the third section, I'll just mention it briefly. She talks about cultures. She says she doesn't mean to racially stereotype a whole group of people. She said she's looking at the research behind it. She said typically Asia is much more of an introverted continent and the US is much more extroverted. And she said that it's important to remember that soft power can win people over. Aggressive power can push people away. So there is a place for us, just like there is a place for this whole continent of people and the changes that they're making. And so she had a lot of really amazing research on there. She goes on to say that, like, when do we actually act like an extrovert? And is that okay? And is that still in honor of who we are? And this is what she talks about in the fourth section on how to love, how to work. So there is a theory based on a man, I think his name is, it says Professor Little. I think his first name was Brian. Anyway, Professor Little, who is very well-known public speaking. He's an amazing professor. He's also very introverted. And he talks about something he calls the free trait theory. He said he believes that fixed traits and free traits coexist, going back to our nurtured versus nature. He said, according to the free trait theory, we are born and culturally endowed with certain personality traits, introversion, for example. But we can and do act out of character in the service of core personal projects. Said introverts are capable of acting like extroverts for the sake of work they consider important, people they love, or anything they highly value. This is why, this is how a lot of us are able to really harness our powers, is that there is a time where we may step into the extrovert ideal very intentionally because it's for a core personal project. It's for someone or something that we really love, and we're doing it in service of that. Now, the important thing, and this is kind of where we're going to start wrapping up, is that it's important for us to recognize that we don't stay there. We may visit that for a time. Okay, imagine this is like you here on your introverted place, and you're going to step over it into the extroverted place. Okay, we're going to write that introverted, extrovert. Now, when we step over, it's always in service of something that we're very passionate about. If we stay there too long, we will burn out. We will become so overstimulated, we will be completely out of sync with our body that our nervous system actually shuts down. And I've seen this, and I've talked about it in past book clubs, like with my fibromyalgia, like suppressing my emotions, like trying to be someone else and not really honoring and listening to my body. What started to happen is my entire body started to shut down. And what I realized as part of that was not only did I need to honor what I was feeling, but I needed to honor why I was feeling those things, because I had this belief I was fundamentally flawed. And so when he talks about like going back to Professor Little, who had this free trait theory that she talked about in the book, said, you can visit this for a time, like he goes and speaks very publicly. And then it's important for him to come back to what he calls restorative niches or niches. I guess you can say it either way, where he has built in times where he can find a place to go back and to retreat. It's not being a hermit, it's being restorative to who you naturally are. And it's funny because as I've thought about this for myself, and I was able to look around, like, where do I do this? I don't always, well, I do it a lot of times when, like I mentioned with church, like I come home and I sometimes sit in my bedroom, sit in my closet, like I need time to like restore myself. But I also notice that I do this in a lot of public settings. For me, one of my restorative niches is that when I am in a very large group, I will always sit on the outside right side, kind of towards the front. It allows me to see the speaker, but it allows me to take in all of this stimulation around me without having to feel overwhelmed by being in the middle of it. One of the other examples is that I've also noticed that I get very overstimulated when I'm on a vacation. And that was really overwhelming and really hard for me because my body would shut down when I'm wanting to go and have fun with my family. And so I've had to build in, like, if we go do an activity in the morning, I'm taking a nap in the afternoon. I'm sitting by myself and my kids are on electronics so that we have separation where I can spend some time being restorative to my introverted state. So that's really what she talks about. The last little bit, and I'm just going to touch on it, is really being able to honor what our children feel. And I was appreciative that she spent time talking about this. She said, create an environment for your children in order for them to flourish and to harness their natural abilities as an introvert without holding them to that extroverted ideal. When you do that, they become who they're meant to be. They become that strong, powerful example of quiet strength, that quiet power. And that's really starts from you as a mom. So I want to leave just a couple minutes. I know we're at 2:00, so I'll see if you need to go, you are welcome to. But I always like to leave a couple minutes at the end. So just really briefly, I'm so excited that we've been able to do this book club. We are going to be taking a break for the next 2 months. I am hoping that by book club next month, there will be a baby here. I am 8 months, almost 9 months pregnant. I am ready to have this baby. I'm ready for the next phase of crazy to start. My hips would much welcome that. So we will not be having book club for the next couple months. So just be on the lookout, for the emails, for the calendar invites, because we will start back up most likely in January for book club. So if you're listening to this on replay or on the podcast for the next couple months, we will have some past recordings also included. So you're still getting those bonus episodes on the podcast because I love sharing those with you. And we've done some really, really amazing books that are on our YouTube channel, but not on the podcast. So for the next couple months, we won't be doing it live. I'll just be sharing some of those past recordings. All right, so thank you everyone for joining. And then Ansi, I'm going to turn off the recording, but you are welcome to stay on if you would like to. I'll see you all after baby comes.